Thank you for tuning into our podcast, Canal Days, What Life Was Like in the Industrial Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and joining us today is Holyoke's very own local historian and creator of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke, Robert Camus. He personally offers and leads public and private tours, as well as presentations of historical sites within communities throughout the state of Massachusetts. Currently, the communities he has chosen to focus on this year are Holyoke, Chicopee, South Hadley, and East Hampton, and also Granby and Amherst as well. His tours spotlight the local canals, reservoirs, cemeteries, and churches, as well as various parks, streets, and selected historical houses within each community. In today's episode, we will be discussing the First Church of Christ Congregational in Northampton. And what is the history of all the additions of this First Congregational?
This church has 5 different buildings through its very long history. You probably know that Northampton was settled very early on. It's a colonial town city, and it was settled in the 1650s, I believe. And thus, it needed a church to go with it, and it soon had to have that church in order to be considered a community within Massachusetts. So today we're going to talk about not only the additions of it, but also some of the features around the front of the church, which should be interesting because this last edition is very old itself, and it's very gorgeous. And within what has become of it, because as you know, most congregational churches aren't what they used to be. They've changed over quite a bit. All right, so the history of the church, 1661, the first edition was built as the First Congregational Church within Northampton. All right, and I don't know how long that lasts, but I do know where it was. It was down by the present-day courthouse, so it was only about 150 feet to 200 feet away. It's very close and on the same side of the street as this church, and it's always stayed either there or the present location, no matter which one of the 5 editions it is. All right, and I don't know when it was taken down, so I wish I know. The one thing I don't know in all these 5 churches is when that first church was even taken down. It probably was a wooden clapboard. They weren't necessarily white back then. A lot of people think that congregational churches have to be white. Well, most of the early 1800 ones are, but the 1600s and 1700 ones, the ones started very early on, weren't necessarily white. That feature came later. All right, now the next one to come along, the second edition of the First Congregational Church, probably came around very early on in the 1700s, and it lasted 1737 before it too was taken down, and it was also at the same location as the first. Then the third edition of the First Congregational Church, that was at the present location. It came around 1737, and it lasted till 1812. All right, and then the fourth edition came around 1812, and it lasted to 1877. All right, then finally you got this modern edition put up as a Gothic Revival Church, with the architect being a person named Peabody. It came up in 1877, and it still exists. It's almost 150 years old now, and it's still a gorgeous building with a lot of historical features. There's a little placard outside the church area put up by Northampton where you can read about this church and its history very well.
And what is in the front steps of the church?
All right, there you're going to find the steps, or the entrance step, to the third edition of the Congregational Church. So we're at the 5th edition, but the 3rd edition steps were saved, at least the first step. It's an oval step. It's smaller than the present day church's steps, but embedded into the ground right in front of the walkway of the steps going up is that first oval step. All right, and it has a plaque telling you that. That church, again, lasted from 1737 to 1812. So this step probably dates to 1737. It's one of the oldest things around Northampton. And the minister at that point was Jonathan Edwards. He was a very famous minister within Northampton. In fact, when a group wanted to branch off from this first Congregational church, they didn't go far away. They built the Edwards Congregational Church for themselves and named it after Jonathan Edwards. All right, so
Really quickly, before we continue with the rest of our interview, just to fill our listeners in, if you want to sign up for any of his tours or find out more information, you can check out his website at holyokecanaltours.org. And there you can find podcasts and videos of the stops along each of his tours, as well as photos and text of the historical sites throughout as well. And for private tours and other inquiries, you can email him directly at bobcat4214, and his tours make for fun, educational, outdoor activities for families and group parties. So just getting back to our interview, tell us about the specific church.
all right, this church here is constructed with a lot of brownstone, this Long Meadow brownstone mined in what is now East Long Meadow. It's a gorgeous looking church. It has a cornerstone embedded into it, and the cornerstone reads the important dates of 1661 and 1877. 1661 is when the parish was made into a congregation, and 1877 was when they first started working on this church itself. And I told you about the front steps, also the front information board put up by Northampton. There's a sign out front that says the First Churches, and that's the modern name, the First Churches, because it's a combination. And I'm going to tell you that when the next question comes up. Also, it has a gorgeous stained glass window inside it, but most of that on the front, being upwards, has a clock within the steeple, probably put up by the city of Northampton itself, because every community needed a clock somewhere around, and they would actually pay churches to allow them to install it up there with an annual fee to that. And then around the sides, a lot more stained glass window. If you ever go inside, I've been in there, and it's quite gorgeous. Right? This was made in a high Gothic style during the Gothic revival times. You can tell that by all the windows are fairly narrow. But if you go inside, it's quite gorgeous inside. And I invite you to go there to get the good flavor of an ancient tradition within Northampton of having a congregational church. This was the first church ever in Northampton of any denominations. So you can get a good sense of what Northampton was all about, and also visit the modern Edwards Congregational Church, an offspring. And there's many more congregational churches around Northampton, because Florence ended up getting one, then two, right? And you get the sense of what the religious movements were.
And what has the church become, and what has it generated?
Okay, it's become today what is called the First Churches. What they mean by that, it's a combination of the First Baptist Church of Northampton, the First Congregational Church of Northampton, and together they decided to take on the name the First Churches, a good name. The First Baptist Church is still there. It's not the original, but it's still there. And like you know, I just gave you all the 5 editions of the Congregational Church. Now, what did the Congregational Church spawn off of itself? Well, it didn't spawn the First Congregational Church in Florence. That did it on its own, and it took on the name Florence Congregational Church because it was its own village. And when you have a village, you don't take on a name like Second Congregational Church. You take on the village name. All right, and then it developed up there the Free Congregational Society of Florence. But most importantly is the Edwards Congregational Church in 1833 decided to form out of the First Congregational Church. And it didn't take on the name Second Congregational Church because it formed out of the First Congregational Church, and it took on an important name to itself, which was the important Jonathan Edwards name, the very important minister. And since it came out peacefully from the other churches because of the growth of that first church was so large, it didn't take on Second Congregational Church. Other communities it would have had, and that means that it's a whole new covenant they agree upon between themselves. It's an entirely independent group from the First Congregational Church. And that kind of system of naming goes on to Third. It also goes to the other denominations. So if a community has a First Baptist Church and the second one wants to form independently, totally, and not even the same people branching off, that would be a Second Baptist Church. That's the way they do it. And they always append the location they're at, so the First Congregational Church of Northampton, so forth. All right, so this is a very Byzantine naming system, but I'm glad you got used to it. And I hope you visit Northampton in this gorgeous church, which is kind of the linchpin of that area.
And thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Robert, for educating us on your tours and historical topics of your expertise. And you can check out a large selection of his podcasts on his website,